Thank you very much for that overkind introduction. It's great to be back in Wollongong. I was conceived here. My parents were married at the St. Mark's, and of course my mother was the daughter of that extraordinary Australian character, the single school teacher, the bush school teacher. He ran the school at Marshall Mount for many years, and my mother went to Wollongong High School on the milk cart with Charmian Clift and Francis James, and so Wollongong High School was really swinging in the 1930s. I passed by the Charmian Clift Reserve, which is certainly not how I gather she would behave, but not with the reserve. But of course, as time went by, my grandfather became he was, as the local school teacher was, he could be trusted with money. And so he became secretary of the Dapto show and even the Dapto dogs. Believe it or not, the Dapto dogs are really something to conjure with, or certainly they were. I remember when the ABC was showing the first moon landing in 1967. It was in the middle of the afternoon, and Neil Armstrong was just about to step on the moon, and the voice came over, "We interrupt this program with the latest news from the Dapto dogs." So my early life was spent, I've been every mailman, even to Dapto. And my father's line, it goes back even further because he was, or is, a Weston. And the Weston family, old Henry, I think, came from a very great manor house. They were squires in Surrey. And I go down past this ancestral house wondering whether I'll actually ever acquire it, because he, in 1816, made the maid pregnant. And of course that was usually handled by the upper classes in England in those days by dispensing with the maid services. And she would go off and the child would be boarded out as an orphan at Corham Fields, if you've read Corham Boy. But extraordinarily, and of course it must have been love, I can't think what else it would have been, but he decided to marry her. And of course this was so shameful in the early 19th century that he had to leave Surrey and had to, in a hurry, and go as far away from the gentry of Surrey that he could imagine. So he turned up in Sydney Harbour in 1817. And Governor Macquarie was so thrilled to get a member of the English upper classes and not a convict that he actually gave him a massive land grant of 500 acres where Illawarra, from Port Kembla onwards. So and of course the Weston family still, I think, he built a home at Horsley, which I think is in West Dapto, modelled on the Horsley in Surrey. So when a journalist from the Illawarra Mercury or whatever asked me whether I had any links with the area as I came in, do I have links? So, and this is the first time, though, I visited the university, and it is an extraordinary place, a wonderful place. I've been strolling through the botanical gardens a little earlier, and so I'm very happy to be here for the first time talking to you rather than surfing at North Beach. What I want to talk to you today about is human rights. Let me try to talk about what are they, how they developed, what future they should have in Australia and the world. And I'll talk a little about history, how we acquired them, what particular significance they have for Australians, and whether at the end of the day we should have a Bill of Rights. So I'm told I've got 50 minutes, and I'll try to do all of that and take you on a little guided tour of the human rights statute books? Well, we begin, don't we, with Magna Carta. Everyone thinks that human rights go back to Magna Carta. They don't. Magna Carta was a pretty squalid deal in 1215 between the king and his feuding feudal barons. And it was remarkable for its time, but it didn't really have any effect. It was a way of curbing the power of the supreme ruler, but only in the interests of the barons and the upper classes. And it wasn't until 1628 when a great former judge, he was a judge who'd been sacked by the king because he had dared to suggest that the judges should be independent. Until that time, they had been held their office subject to the royal will, and if they displeased the king, they were sacked. But this great lawyer drafted the Declaration of Right of 1628, which gave teeth to Magna Carta's great promise that to no one will we deny, to no one will we delay justice or right. This extraordinary promise, given new meaning of habeas corpus, was the first great achievement of Magna Carta, the right of any person who had been held in custody to come to a court and to demand that the detaining power, the police, the government, whatever, should justify the legality of their incarceration. So in 1628, the Magna Carta, reformed in the Declaration of Right, was presented to the king, King Charles I. He was brought up to believe in divine right. He thought that he was the absolute ruler appointed by God, and so he waved it away. He wasn't interested in any declaration of right. When Parliament was upset, he took the simple step of abolishing Parliament, and so for 12 years there was no Parliament. Parliament, too, like the judges, was completely at the whim of this absolute king. And a lot of people in the 1630s, the Puritans, went off to America because they despaired of any, and they founded America, but they were in a sense, but they despaired of any achievement of people's will in England. And it wasn't until the great English Civil War of 1641 that the first rights were achieved. They were achieved by the Parliamentary Army fighting the king, by Cromwell, and by an internecine battle in which 1 in 10 Englishmen was laid on the muddy fields. It was a ferocious time, more casualties comparatively than in the First World War. But what that battle achieved was, first of all, the abolition of torture. The King's Star Chamber, which was able to torture opponents of the king, was abolished, and there was never a torture warrant issued in England since 1641, which was some achievement, because thereafter torture was something that was done by the French, and they did it a lot. For the next 200 years in Europe, any suspect, you've seen Tosca, the opera, and in the second act the judge comes on and the painter Caravadossi is taken down and tortured. That was what went on routinely in Europe, torture by judicial order. But that was the first great achievement. And then the judges were made independent. That was an extraordinary achievement. And Parliament was given a sovereign power over the king. So that was the achievement of the Civil War. There was a certain amount, for the first time for a while, we had freedom of speech. The great poet John Milton wrote his Areopagitica, the great argument for freedom of speech, describing censorship that had existed until then as like the exploit of the gallant farmer who tries to keep out the crows by shutting the park gate. That was his view of censorship. And even comparative religious liberty. for everyone except Catholics at a time when the Pope was regarded a bit like Bin Laden is today. So but even that was guaranteed. And then, of course, Britain had a republic. The British don't like to think of that all the great achievements in civil liberty go back to the time of the British Republic. And they even put the king on trial, the trial of the king for torture. For torturing prisoners of war in 1649. And I wrote a book called The Tyrannicide Brief about the extraordinary lawyer who prosecuted the king. And of course, 11 years later, it was the lawyer who prosecuted the king and the judges, the king who had signed the king's death warrant, who themselves were put on trial and hung, drawn, and quartered at the Restoration. I had to tell trained the Iraqi judges who were trying Saddam Hussein, and I told them this unhappy story, which didn't go down well at their first dinner. But that was the fate of these reformers. But it was quite funny because in 1660, when the king and the king's men came back, and the first 10 of the great Republican heroes made, because one thing you always had was the right to speak from the gallows before you were turned off, executed. And these heroes spoke so courageously and so bravely that the crowd started to turn against the king. They'd welcomed Charles II back with open arms. They turned against him. And of course, they couldn't, after they'd executed the first 10, the king's advisors said, we can't execute any more because the crowds are turning against us. But the king said, well, we've got the hundreds of these dangerous Republicans who are in the prisons, and what are we going to do with them? Because there was habeas corpus, had the great right and they had to be either tried or released. And the king had a very smart attorney general who said, I know what we'll do. We'll put them on offshore islands where habeas corpus doesn't run. And this was the precedent for Guantanamo Bay. And they put them in Jersey, and they put them off in islands off Plymouth and so on. And it was regarded as devious even then. And when Parliament got its act together with the 1679 Habeas Corpus Act, it applied habeas corpus to offshore islands. And there was a great moment in the Supreme Court in America a couple of years ago in one of the cases where, because the Bush lawyers, quite literally Bush lawyers, had persuaded the president that they could put them on Guantanamo Bay and that habeas corpus would not, the great writ wouldn't get there. And Justice Stevens, in the Supreme Court decision, which decided that habeas corpus would indeed apply to Guantanamo, pointed out that this had been the case ever since 1679, when America was part of Britain, and that the 1679 Act still ran. So that's what I see as our basic civil rights. And remember that when Arthur Phillip comes to Australia in 1788 and plants the Union Jack, he is, by force of law, he is importing all the laws that were appropriate in a new colony. And so these rights that were embedded in English law, there weren't many more, certainly in the following century, in the 1750s and 60s. There was a character called John Wilkes, who was famous for establishing the principle that an Englishman's home is his castle, when he published a newspaper called the North Briton, and he said, it said to George III that he'd never heard the language of truth until he heard it in the complaints of his subjects. And he was prosecuted for sedition, and his printing press was seized, and he took the government to court and won a great victory and won damages against the Treasury and against the ministers for invading his home and seizing his press. And that established initially the right of individuals to sue the government and to win damages if they were badly treated. He was an MP. He made the mistake of writing some and printing some rather rude poems. And so they, not being able to get him for sedition, they prosecuted him for obscenity. And in those days, the prosecution was brought by one of his enemies in the House of Lords, and which was the highest court. And he got up and started to read from this poem, the essay on woman. Life can little more supply than just a few good fucks, and then we die. And he said, I don't know whether I should go on, my lords. And they all shouted, go on, go on. And Wilkes was jailed for 2 years for obscenity, and he was elected 3 times. 3 times. His constituents, despite the attempts of the government to silence him by sending him to prison, they re-elected him. And we have John Hatton here, a great figure in the Australian context and in the local context, but I see John Hatton as one of those like John Wilkes who have fought against the determination of governments to silence them. So there you are. So they were the rights that Arthur Phillip brought to the muddy shore of not Botany Bay. They sailed off to around the corner to Port Jackson, seeing as they passed the 2 sails of La Perouse, the French ship, and they just beat the French to Australia. I guess the food would be much better if we'd been colonized by the French, but we wouldn't have cricket or the Church of England. But we'd still have Catholic saints who do miracles, apparently. Now, if the importance of Australia was, I think we've got a good story to tell in those early days, because the first fleet, as it was being provisioned, it had, bizarrely, Arthur Phillip is a great story, and it's appalling that he's never had a proper biography, but he was a partly Jewish, poor kid from the East End who had a naval relative and worked his way up. He worked in the Portuguese Navy. He was a spy for the Portuguese, which actually saved the first fleet from destruction, because when he got to Rio, they welcomed him with open arms, unlike the second fleet, half of whom perished on the voyage. But before Phillip set sail, and he wouldn't set sail, he refused to set sail until the ships were properly provisioned in Plymouth. In a little room in the Admiralty, he was the only person who thought that what he was doing would ever end up as more than an open prison. He really believed that one day there would be a great country, and he mulled over the first law for this country that only he ever believed would come into existence. And he said, well, the first law will be that there can be no freedom in a country with slavery. So the first law will be that this country shall have no slaves. And this isn't a bad first law of Australia, because it was 20 years before Wilberforce in 1807 secured the beginnings of the repeal of the slavery laws. So Australia was founded, bizarrely enough, with that very progressive view. And of course, the early Australian history is a battle for representation, a battle for trial by jury. The emancipists, Macquarie is thought of at the moment because it's a bicentenary, but it was, of course, only with Phillip's attitudes to the Aborigines, his determination to make them equal partners, his punishment of all who lifted a finger against them, his suffering spear wounds at Manly. He did set down a mode of treatment that on his departure was forgotten, and we had the massacres beginning in Risdon Cove in Tasmania and so forth, the dark side of Australian history. But we did fight for those rights. Well, what was happening in the rest of the world? Because we think of bills of rights in terms of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the American Declaration of Independence. But, of course, they were great for their time, but there was no enforcement system, and the theory upon which they were based was very much a natural right theory, as Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the draftsmen of the Declaration of Independence, said. You know, these rights are God-given. They are there like the sunshine in every day. And the natural rights, the idea of rights coming from nature or coming from God, was debunked in the next century by two great intellectual giants of the 19th century. One was Jeremy Bentham, who pointed out that the idea of natural rights is nonsense on stilts, as he said. And the other was Karl Marx, who argued that all this rights talk were really bourgeois rights. And so the idea of human rights was never discussed. The great philosophers like Bentham and Marx deprecated them as natural rights as being philosophically unsound. And there was very little that happened in the 19th century. We managed to abolish slavery. We developed a law against piracy, a universal jurisdiction. The pirate is the enemy of mankind, so any state can take him on the high seas. We did a little in terms of limiting armaments. We had some conferences in the late 19th century, but that was mainly because of their cost. No one was concerned about the humanitarian side of limiting arms. The arms conferences that limited dum-dum bullets and so on were called purely because the great colonizing nations were unhappy with the amount of money that they were having to spend to keep up with each other's armaments. So by the time of the First World War, there was no international criminal law and there was no law that would stop states doing whatever they liked to their own people. Political and military leaders could not be held to account for mass murder. And this was the situation in 1915 when the Ottoman Empire, as the Allies, the Australian forces, were landing at Gallipoli, on that night, the intellectuals of the Armenian community in Istanbul were kidnapped and killed, and the deportations in the subsequent months of the 2 million Armenians, some 1 million were killed or starved to death in the course of those deportations. The British, French, and Russians met and declared this a crime against humanity. And the British promised that there would be nemesis, that the young Turks who had done this would be brought to trial. And they did round up some 67 of them and brought them to trial in Malta after the war, but they had to let them go because there was no law, no international criminal law, no human rights law that could be enforced. And in fact, it's worth remembering that Hitler, on the border with Poland in 1939, as he urged his generals to show no mercy, what he said was, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" There was no one did, because there was no enforceable human rights law. Indeed, there was no sense of human rights. It's interesting that even as late as the 1930s, when the lights were going out all over Europe, there was no concept, no talk of human rights, no statesman, no court, the Permanent Court of International Justice, the League of Nations were not interested in human rights. And really the revival owes itself to an extraordinary group of middle-class socialist writers chaired by H.G. Wells. There was H.G. Wells and J.B. Priestley, and A.A. Milne would motor up from Pooh Corner to join the group, and they drafted a universal Declaration of Human Rights based on the concept of human dignity. They eschewed all the grand statements of the American and French declarations, and their declaration began, because a man is born into the world through no fault of his own, he's due in equity to and justice to these rights. And they enumerated them in a wonderful prose, and it was, and they came up with the idea of a universal set of human rights that could be enforced by a body like the United Nations. And as the war clouds gathered in 1939, this was published as a little Penguin special, H.G. Wells on the Rights of Man, and it sold 100,000 copies overnight. It was translated into 30 languages. It seemed to be the sort of plank in a thunderstorm, some kind of way of avoiding the war that Europe was headed for. But the British Foreign Office was so excited by it, they translated it into German and they dropped it on the Nazi tanks as they were crossing France. And they didn't stop to read it, of course. But the person who did was a friend of Wells, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it inspired his famous Four Freedoms speech of after Pearl Harbor. We're fighting for freedom of speech and religion, freedom from want and from fear. And it was then, and then only, with the Atlantic Charter following a few weeks later in January 1942, the promise that what we're fighting for in our own lands and abroad were human rights, rights based on human dignity. So that historically is where human rights, the modern concept, begins. The idea of enforceable human rights was taken to its logical conclusion by Nuremberg. The idea that instead of letting the Young Turks go after they'd killed 1 million of their own people, that those who committed what the Nuremberg statute called crimes against humanity could be prosecuted, that there would be an international criminal law at the basis that could enforce fundamental human rights. But it was very fortunate that we got Nuremberg at all, because Churchill was violently opposed. He feared that Nuremberg would give Hitler a platform, that he would use the witness box as a platform to justify his policies. And so Churchill had another idea. He drew up a list of the top 75 Nazi leaders, and that on their arrest they were to be given 6 hours to say their prayers, and then they were to be shot. He came up against Truman, who'd taken over from Roosevelt, and Jackson, his legal advisor, U.S. Supreme Court Justice, later the prosecutor. And the wonderful letter, even more wonderful when you consider more recent American attitudes to international justice, where they said that to try the Nazis without a fair trial would not sit well on the American conscience or be remembered by our children with pride. And so they insisted upon the trial at Nuremberg. And there was a complete breach, a complete impasse between the two great allies. And the stalemate eventually was broken by the third ally, Joe Stalin, who loved show trials as long as everyone got shot in the end. And he voted for Nuremberg, and that is how we managed to get the Nuremberg Trials. And it was extraordinary how the legend, really, they captured the imagination. I often look at that. Goering's first instinct, and he was leading the Nazis at this stage, was to simply not cooperate. He said, look, all we're going to say to these judges, a catchphrase of one of Goethe's warrior heroes, loosely translated as kiss my ass. And that was all they were going to say. But as the preparation went on, they got sucked into making their excuses to posterity. This was going to be a fair, or at least fairish, trial, which, of course, the Nazis themselves hadn't given to their victims. And so Nuremberg worked. And it worked because, as Jackson, who became the prosecutor at Nuremberg, said, because of the Teutonic habit of writing everything down. They had the Goering signatures on the Night and Fog decrees. They had the entire evidence of the German bureaucracy to use. And I've been president of the UN War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone, and it really sometimes is a far cry from Nuremberg, although we are trying to deliver on the legend of Nuremberg. It's a very different thing when you're making inferences from mass graves and when you have to give indulgences and amnesties to individuals in order to get them to protect them, in order to establish those who are most responsible. But at the end of the Second World War, we get the great human rights triptych. We get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The day before, we got the Genocide Convention, and a few months later, we got the Geneva Conventions. And these three events of 1948 are and remain the great human rights triptych. The Geneva Conventions requiring that basic humane treatment for prisoners of war, making it a war crime to put civilians at risk, the Genocide Convention obliging states to intervene, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which had its 60th anniversary a little while ago. Let me come back to Australia and catch up, because extraordinary things had been happening in Australia. There had been, of course, we inherited the great Benthamite reforms, particularly compulsory secular education in the 1890s, the trade union movement, the seamen's strike, I think, in the 1880s, which produced both the Waltzing Matilda and the Australian Labor Party, emerged from that, blood on the wattle, Henry Lawson's. And then we had an extraordinary, in the 20th century, Australia probably achieved more for workers' rights than any other country. There was the 40-hour week, the basic wage, health insurance, even the smoko, the fabled smoko, which now I suppose politically incorrect to think of it, but was very important in its time as the basic right of workers to downtime. So in these respects, in social and economic rights, Australia had a great story to tell, even though at Federation there had been nothing written into the Constitution about human rights for very unattractive reasons, reasons that were, in retrospect today, read appallingly as racist reasons. The young Attorney General of Tasmania had been in America, he'd come back wanting a due process clause in the Australian Constitution, wanting a Bill of Rights in the Australian Constitution. But that was blocked both by the trade unionists who feared that it would encourage Chinese immigration, and by the Sir John Forrest and the other employers who recognized and said in very clear terms that Australia, they wanted a white Australia policy, and that was the, the prime object, or one of their prime objects of federation. So we have this strange situation where Australia at federation rejects a Bill of Rights, but where the trade union movement produces an extraordinary set of workers' rights that are perhaps by the 1940s the leading rights in the world. And the other thing that Australia produced, which is not, who is not recognized as perhaps he should be, is the extraordinary architect of the post-war settlement, the architect of the Universal Declaration, the Genocide Convention and the Geneva Conventions, and the United Nations Charter, Dr. Evatt. Dr. Evatt was, and it's interesting, I'm a neighbour and friend of Michael Foot, the great English Labour leader, historian, journalist. He was a young journalist at San Francisco in 1945, and he said he still remembers Evatt as towering above any other statesman. There was an editorial in the New York Times, of all places, saying that the one man who stood head and shoulders above any other statesman was Dr. Evatt. His ability at drafting and his representing the also-ran countries, the middle-ranking powers, was astonishing. At the Paris Peace Conference, his voice was heard again. He was the first to suggest a European Court of Human Rights. 6 years later, it came to pass and is now the most effective human rights court. He became the third president of the United Nations General Assembly. He befriended a very strange Polish lawyer called Raphael Lemkin, who had come up with the concept of genocide, the law that would be required, the international law that would be required to put political and military leaders on trial. And so it was Evatt who ushered in the Genocide Convention. It was Evatt who, from Canberra, instructed the Australian delegation on the drafting commission of the Universal Declaration to insist on economic and social rights. And if you look at the actual drafting history of the Universal Declaration, you find that a lot of it is owed to Evatt and to the Australian delegation. The Americans were very hostile to putting economic and social rights in the delegation. It was the Australian Colonel Hodgson, who was Evatt's spokesman, who said to Eleanor Roosevelt, "Listen, love, your husband's third freedom was freedom from want." And that persuaded Eleanor to accept the social and economic rights that are now the rights to health, basic health care, the rights to basic education, and the rights to join a trade union for and for workers to have sufficient leisure to enjoy their lives, all down to Australia. So that is an extraordinary period in a country which had only 7 million people playing that part in the at the time when these great rights were forged. The Universal Declaration remains still an aspiration. It's a declaration, not a convention. The Geneva Conventions remain absolutely fundamental, and it took 2 years ago, the Supreme Court, again overruling the Bush lawyers, held that they applied as part of American law and justified the end of torture at Guantanamo Bay. The Genocide Convention, one of the very few conventions that America has signed and ratified. America tends to think it's above international law. International law is all very well for other countries, but not America. And it was, again, something of a happenstance that America signed up to it. Ronald Reagan signed it in 1986 after he'd gone to Bitburg Cemetery, where there were SS graves. And a young, bearded, obese protester in Michigan heard that there were SS graves, and he and a mate got on a plane and flew to Bitburg, and just as Reagan was arriving, they held up a banner about the Reagan honors SS graves. And it, of course, went round the world. The Jewish lobby in America were furious and threatened to pull support from the Republicans and to pacify them. 3 weeks later, Ronald Reagan ratified the Genocide Convention, and the young, obese, bearded protester from Flint, Michigan, was Michael Moore, making as I've told him, his most effective protest ever. But that's how America came to ratify the Genocide Convention. So this, at this international level, we are achieving a degree of enforcement of the kind that H.G. Wells and others dreamt about, and Doc Evett, of course. Following on H.G. Wells, if you read the Doc's speeches on behalf of Australia, at that time, he argued for enforceability. It is still, and one sees there are, my old court in Sierra Leone, although it's sitting in The Hague, has got Charles Taylor on trial. Karadzic is coming up. Milosevic was a trial that was not very successful, and he died in the middle of it. But international justice at this basic level is proceeding. We still have our difficulties. One of the great battles, of course, is over the death penalty. We had a great fight between the British, for whom I was one of the representatives, and the Americans over the trial of Saddam Hussein. There was a period when, after his capture, when we had to train the judges, and we argued very emphatically that he should not face the death penalty and should have an international trial, because international courts can't pass the death penalty. And the Americans said, well, we must have him executed. They had no doubt about his guilt. We must execute him. You really want him to stay in Iraq? You can't have him imprisoned in Iraq. We said, no, we don't want him in prison in Iraq. He'd have to go to where they put the other prisoners from The Hague. Finland was prepared to take him. Finland, the Americans snorted, steam coming out of their ears. But he gets conjugal visits in Finland. He'll have cable television. So they even look at access to 140 channels, mainly showing pornography. We can't have this, possibly. So I suggested that we do what we did with Napoleon and put him on St. Helena. And the British Foreign Office took me seriously enough to actually inquire of the St. Helenans whether they would take him. And they said, we're very sorry, you're trying to build a tourist industry here. So they weren't prepared to have him. And I did try the Falklands, thought that the best way of ending the days of Saddam and Milosevic and their likes, having them commune with penguins and never be heard of again. But that debate still goes on at that level. But we are slowly, I think, we are developing in the way that Doc Everett and the founders of the United Nations and of the human rights triptych would have wished. It's taking a long time, but the hope is that the Obama administration are making noises about actually joining the International Criminal Court next year. There's a conference that they'll probably come in as associate members. And so the absurd hostility of the Bush administration seems a day gone by. Well, what about the idea of a Bill of Rights in Australia? What is the advantage? What advantage would it be for us to do what Everett himself wished and to have our own Bill of Rights? This has recently been studied by Frank Brennan's commission, and it's a very long report. These reports invariably are, but it came down in favor of a Bill of Rights because that would, it thought, do a lot for those who fall through the cracks. And there's undoubtedly a strong argument for assisting those who fall through the cracks. But a Bill of Rights has other advantages. And I've been involved in agitating for one in Britain, and we got one 10 years ago. And it has assisted in bringing governments, bringing local councils in particular, to account. This is because it picks up on the great insight of H.G. Wells and J.B. Priestley and A.A. Milne that actually what matters is human dignity. And it has been to assist human dignity that the Bill of Rights in Britain in the last 10 years has been so important. It's not, there have been great cases in which torture evidence was thrown out, in which it was held by the highest court that you can't keep people locked up forever without trial, as they were trying to do with terrorist suspects. At that level, a Bill of Rights is a reminder of our great history, the history that we inherited in part from Britain and the history that we have made for ourselves. But it also operates at a very fundamental level. And the great thing about the Bill of Rights is that after 10 years, the thinking behind it percolates through to hospitals, to care homes, to social community service workers become aware of what they can achieve for their clients. And it has meant hundreds of silly, routine practices in British hospitals, for example. There was a publication a few months ago that listed all the practices that were stopped by the Bill of Rights. The practice of putting elderly husbands and wives in separate care homes. The practice, I think the worst was probably they found the hospital where time and motion people had been through and decided that some of the elderly inhabitants should be served their breakfast while they were sitting on the toilet. That sort of thing. I mean, that's sort of the worst example, but there are a lot more of run-of-the-mill invasions of dignity. And when I come back here and talk to people, I had a friend, Patrick Cook, the cartoonist, was telling me how his father was a naval officer and always very proud, of course, of his naval beard. The minute he was taken to Mona Vale Hospital without his asking him or without any sort of consent, his naval beard was shaved off, the pride and joy. I had another friend whose father was doing his driving as they have to, and rightly so, after about the age of 75 or 80 in New South Wales. You've got to do your driving test. And his father failed. 60 years he'd had his license. But instead of notifying him later or telling him and asking him to hand in his license. They have some special pair of pliers that cuts up the plastic license in front of their eyes. This is all these little erosions of dignity. You can imagine how humiliating it is to wake up to find that your naval beard that you've had for 50 years, to actually see your license being cut up in front of your eyes. It is those minute things that you just don't realize are humiliating and embarrassing, that a Bill of Rights consciousness can help to combat. There is also, I think, and this is the other reason why Australia should have a Bill of Rights, is that, does anyone have my book? You have it. Let me. Is that it can, I'll give it back to you, is that it can actually do something about national pride and identity. And those countries that have, Canada had no basis for any kind of pride, but until Trudeau hit upon the idea of a Charter of Rights, and New Zealand and other countries like that actually find in their charter something to be proud of. There was the famous story of Jefferson, who was sent away to draft the Declaration of Independence, and he came back and read his first draft to John Adams and Ben Franklin, and it said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and inviolable, that all men are created equal, blah, blah, blah." And Ben Franklin said, "Sacred and inviolable? Smacks of the pulpit, Mr. Jefferson, smacks of the pulpit." And he then looked at the all men are created equal. He said, "These truths are self-evident, aren't they?" And Jefferson said, "I suppose they are." So he struck out sacred and inviolable and put in self-evident, and the rest is history. But it's not easy to draft a preamble. John Howard attempted one in 1999. "We value excellence as well as fairness, independence as dearly as mateship." And this stumblebum effort was rejected at the referendum. So I don't by any means suggest that my preamble is anything definitive, but I tried to perhaps suggest how we could develop a charter that is based on our own history and something that can be taught to kids at school, something that can give them a sense of what it is, what we value, and our values. And so the act to declare the rights and freedoms of the people and to make better provision for liberty in Australia might begin by saying, "Parliament, conscious of its democratic duty to uphold, protect and advance the hard-won liberties of the Australian people, united in one indissoluble commonwealth, humble in acknowledging the first owners and occupiers of this unique continent, whose ancestors have walked about on its earth for many thousands of years before British settlement, sorrowful for the dispossession, discrimination and degradation they have endured, and resolved hereafter to respect their relationship with the land and to atone for past wrongs by future equity. Proud nonetheless of our progress from penal colony to a free nation of boundless opportunity, unrestricted by divisions of class or caste or private wealth, and an example to the world of the ever-present possibility of reformation of the human spirit, dedicated to democracy as defined in the Federal Constitution, under which all who have a stake in the nation shall have a say in its governance, grateful for the British legacy of liberty first planted in this country by Governor Arthur Phillip, for Magna Carta's great promise that to no one will justice be denied or delayed, for jury trial and the importance of free speech, for a common law that presumes innocence and abominates torture, and for the way these fundamental freedoms have been nurtured and embellished by generations of Australians. Cognizance of the achievement of our country in providing better ways of working through labour rights and collective bargaining and the basic wage, mindful that rights entail responsibilities and that Australia expects its people to show tolerance, respect and mutual consideration for their fellows, to abjure violence and embrace peaceful change, and willingly to share community burdens for the common good of the Commonwealth, determined that all shall have a stake in the prosperity of this nation, and those most in need shall have a moral and legal claim on our compassion. Inspired by the Anzac tradition of preparedness to fight for freedom internationally and in our region against any movement that threatens to extinguish the rights of humankind, respectful of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the drafting of which Australia had the privilege to participate, and of all the treaties we have ratified to uphold the dignity of individuals in this nation and throughout the world, resolved that the liberties of our forebears struggled and sacrificed to achieve shall hereafter inure to the benefit of all who live in this land, hereby declares that in order to advance a fair Australia, the liberties set forth in this Charter shall be protected in the manner hereinafter provided. So, thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes.
Yes. I'm speaking as Vice President of the Human Society of New South Wales, which at the moment has taken a position opposing the right, surprisingly. And I have been at cross swords with the other Vice President who says we don't want to be shackled by human rights laws, but has appealed to every form of prejudice. First, perhaps you could give me an answer back to this, or even better, would you speak to the Human Society of New South Wales and put them straight?
I'm very happy to do so. I find it very odd that the Humanist Society should want to avoid a declaration of humanist, humane views. Usually it's the churches. The other side, I would have thought the Catholic Church is always an opponent because they think that it's going to do terrible things, which it doesn't, because freedom of religion is one of the fundamental freedoms that we have. So, yes, I would think it's a contradiction in terms for a humanist society to oppose a Bill of Rights.
Well, I think so too. It's only the New South Wales chapter, so you'll be most welcome.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Problems with extremist views and religious groups around the world?
Could you use the microphone, please?
Geoffrey, have you had problems with some of the religious extremists around the world?
Problems with religious extremists. I think that the right to, I'll need that book again, I'm afraid. The right, yeah, I will. I have drafted a Bill of Rights as a result of the right to religious freedom is very important, but it's a right that has to be limited, and freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change religion or belief. That is very important. No law against apostasy. Freedom either alone or in community with others to manifest religion or belief in worship or other forms of observance, and to expound the tenets of that religion to others. This freedom shall not extend to religious or other movements that preach hatred or incite violence, and shall not protect religions from criticism made by persons exercising their free speech rights. So, yes, you do have problems with those who take up a religious position that involves the murder of others or the denial of rights to others, and I think that is the kind of calibration that I would come up with.
Some questions from the other campuses.
Oh yes. Hello there. Let's bring you in.
If we could have some questions from the other campuses first before we return to this audience. So either Karen, Patrick, Brendan, or Penelope. Do you have anyone who'd like to ask a question?
Yeah, we've got Angel John here ready to ask you a question.
Yes, Geoffrey, John Gatland from Liga. How can the community assure that the government of New South Wales is made to comply with their own statutes? If government doesn't comply with its own statute, how can we make them comply with a statute that involves a community process? This is an environmental matter with regards to the Snowy River.
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, because bills of rights are another weapon against arrogant and governments, and they have been capable of use by communities and by community groups. And to, for example, I've drafted a Bill of Rights that does have, as the most recent bills do, environmental rights. It's a right to a pristine and healthy environment. Everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being, to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations through reasonable legislative and other measures that prevent pollution and ecological degradation, and so on and so forth. And I think it is very important to spell out the environmental rights. But governments, of course, do have legislation, and very often legislation that is quite detailed on environmental rights, and it's important to be able to assert against governments their own law and to make governments comply with law. And that is, of course, a function of what is called judicial review. But when you tune in to the Bill of Rights debates and hear people like Bob Carr, who is the apostle of governments are entitled to do anything they want, and of course his whole pitch is beware the lawyers. Judges are just sort of lawyers with wigs and gowns, and his whole lawyer phobia. Whereas, in fact, the lawyers who do this kind of work are generally lawyers in either trade union offices or human rights law centres and Redfern Law Centre and so on, whose average take-home pay is less than a cadet journalist. And they are the ones at the sharp end. So the whole idea that bills of rights are a lawyer's banquet is frankly nonsense, and is used by the editors of The Australian and people like Bob Carr to argue against, to as it were, get prejudice against a Bill of Rights. But quite frankly, a Bill of Rights' great use is to curb the arrogance of government. And to do that, you have to go to court, because only courts can stop governments, only courts can require governments to abide by their own laws. So that I think that is that's one of the reasons, in fact, for supporting a Bill of Rights and for supporting judicial review. Oh, we want government by politicians, not by lawyers. Well, who would you rather? If you had a really serious, if you'd been treated unfairly by the bureaucracy, and this is what many Bill of Rights cases are, cases of sheer bloody-minded, bureaucratic, unfair treatment of civilians. Who would you rather decide it? Would you rather Belinda Neal or someone, or Justice Jim Spiegelman or Robert French or someone? You know, you've got to have an impartial arbiter. And so at the end of the day, courts are the way to hold governments to account and to hold them to their own laws.
In Geoffrey's book, he talks about boundless opportunities in his proposed preamble, but we've got bounded opportunity here. So we're going to need to keep the questions short and simple. If anyone wants to recount their life story before asking a question, I'll cut them off. I'm given special powers to do that. So we might move to Batemans Bay. So Karen, does anyone from Batemans Bay have a question?
Lovely. Now they're all fine in this room, but I wonder if I could ask a test over in the other room. If there are any questions over there, Roger? No, thanks.
Okay. Move to another camera shot. So Shoalhaven, Brendan, is anyone at Shoalhaven have a question for Geoffrey?
Yes, I have. My name is Resh Abinara. It appears to me I'm totally in favour of the Bill of Rights. I don't see how any country could call itself democratic without one. But the problem is, once we have given this power to Parliament and politicians, etc., they are extremely unlikely to ever give it up voluntarily. Without some sort of major upheaval, as occurred maybe in South Africa several years ago, how do we get a Bill of Rights? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question, and it is, you're quite right. Bills of rights in many countries, notably America, which forged its Bill of Rights in a time of revolution, a courageous, enormously courageous revolution when you realize what those guys were up against. The British Army at its height, the Hessians, the German mercenaries with their bayonets. It was understandably something that their kids can read at school. Canada is an interesting example of a Bill of Rights that was imposed by Pierre Trudeau, probably the most far-sighted leader they'd ever had, who saw a charter as a way of binding together a rather disparate country with Quebec and the rest of Canada. And that seems to have worked. South Africa, as you mentioned, its Bill of Rights came as a result of the after the overthrow of apartheid, and it was for that reason, I think, because it had some great advocates like Albie Sachs and Arthur Chaskalton and Cato Reagan and so on. It included economic and social rights, so in many ways it was progressive. And the courts have in South Africa, in a number of notable cases, ensured that crazy government policies, particularly in relation to withholding AIDS treatment because of some absurd reasons, some 300,000 people's lives were saved, according to a recent Harvard study, by the courts using their powers under the Bill of Rights to ensure that those treatments were there. But it is going to be difficult. In Britain, we got a Bill of Rights because the parties agreed. The Conservative Party was not opposed. It was the first thing on Tony Blair's agenda when he was elected, and we had already in the background the European Convention, to which Britain was a signature, and where a lot of cases, in fact, beating was stopped at British schools, for example, because of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, even though the British judge said that he'd been to Eton and flogging hadn't done him any harm. He was one dissenter and 16 in favour. So a great, we already had that consciousness. But now the British, David Cameron, the leader of the Tory party and perhaps the next Prime Minister, has demanded a British Bill of Rights, so that in fact the Conservative Party is more keener on a Bill of Rights being a British Bill of Rights than the Labour Party. It's interesting that to see just how far behind the 8 ball the Australian Liberals are. I would have thought that another couple of terms in opposition for the Liberal Party federally might bring about that consensus, and probably when Malcolm Turnbull returns to lead them in 8 years' time, they may be prepared. But it is astonishing, isn't it, that faced with so much maladministration, so much incompetence and so much arrogance in the state Labour governments, that still, for some reason, the Liberal Party on a state basis hasn't cottoned on to the idea. It is bewildering, perhaps because it seems to be a qualification for pre-selection in the state Liberal Party that you believe in the literal truth of the Bible. But I don't know why that it is. But we've had an effective bill in Victoria and in the ACT, and it would seem that it may well be that the way forward will be for state governments to adopt a Bill of Rights. When it's realized that the sky doesn't fall, then eventually we'll get cross-party agreement federally.
Penny, I'm wondering at Moss Vale, does anyone have a question?
Yes, Carl does. In view that the Bill of Rights will take years to set will take years to come through, how can we now stop developers and governments from destroying pristine waterways, arable land and fresh air?
Well, we have to use what we can. I mean, one of the great things about bills of rights is that they are now entering the law in a lot of countries where we look up to. We have cases from Britain, from South Africa, from New Zealand, from America. It may be that we can use some of those rights-based cases because, you see, the common law was a thing of shreds and patches. Parts of it were very good, and I've described habeas corpus and the rule against torture and so on. That's been terrific, but it also had many, many gaps, and a Bill of Rights covers those gaps and enables courts to operate in a wider and more effective and more modern way. And it may be that using some of this law from other countries, our lawyers can work it into a basis for challenge. The other area, as I say, is to encourage states to adopt bills of rights. The Victorian government has done so. There was a very interesting example, which may not be actually, it was not an environmental example, but there was a decision taken to exempt from rights to special treatment in schools children with Asperger's. And it was challenged under the Bill of Rights, and the government fought right till the end, to the court door, and then gave in. And the result was that kids with Asperger's had their entitlement to special treatment. And that was an absolutely good example of what can, the ability to challenge governments and to get mistaken policies reversed by using the Bill of Rights. So it may be that the first step is to encourage state governments to pass bills of rights. But the environment is a different matter. It is a matter that perhaps the only way is to take direct action to protect the environment at the end of the day until we get a Bill of Rights with the right to a healthy and pristine environment included in it.
All right, I'm wondering, is there... I'm wondering, is there anyone in Lecture Theatre 20.4 who has a question for Geoffrey?
Walk across.
Maybe you could do a double.
Yeah, I could. Good. I don't know whether these would still follow. Right.
20.4 has gone quiet, clearly. So 20.5. So I'm wondering, is there anyone in this theatre who has a question for Geoffrey, and given that we have bounded opportunities.
Yes,
Geoffrey, this is on the subject. There is someone. Sorry, there's someone who's wanting to point forward. They can just.
I'll come back to you.
Apparently not.
Hello.
Go, Philip, yes.
Geoffrey, thank you for your talk. Please a bit more about the Victorian one. You mentioned also the ACT and I think also New Zealand. Also South Australia has taken the lead in the greenhouse. Is it possible that South Australia may be interested in this as well?
I'd like to think so, because, I mean, from my university days here, we always looked to Don Dunstan's government to take the first steps on any progressive law. They were the first to appoint a woman judge, Roman Mitchell. They were the first to have anti-discrimination law. They were first to have a Race Relations Act. South Australia does have a great history in the late 60s of beginning a range of human rights legislation, and one would like to see that the initiatives kept up. And so I would hope the Rand government would realise that if it is to survive, it should recapture some of that idealism and drive that Dunstan's government had in the late 60s.
Okay, yes, go.
Geoffrey, on the subject of freedom of speech, what chance do you think there is that Australia may relax its defamation laws, and what do you think may drive that change?
Well, this is a very good example of why we need a Bill of Rights. We are now 39th in the world in protection of freedom of speech. This is particularly because we inherited the British law of libel. The British law of libel was forged in the clubs of London in the late 19th century. The leading cases are all about chaps who cheated at cards or shot foxes. It was a terrible libel to say of a gentleman that he shot a fox, because, of course, true gentlemen hunted foxes down with dogs. They didn't shoot. And these are the leading cases. And to protect the upper classes, libel was made very easy in England because the burden of proof was reversed. It's the only civil law, the only tort law, where you have to prove that the press have to prove that they're right, and it's the only area of law that, until very recently, and thanks to the Human Rights Bill, didn't have any kind of public interest defence. And so what has happened, thanks to the Bill of Rights in Britain, is that British libel law now has a public interest defence for people who criticise local government and business and so forth. And in Australia it doesn't. We have a very narrow public interest defence that protects only federal politicians and doesn't go any wider. So a Bill of Rights is necessary to change, to make yes, in Australia, yes, we don't have free speech, we have expensive speech, because the costs can be so great. If you badly review a restaurant in the Sydney Morning Herald, you'd be sued. I read some poor fellow up in Byron Bay, a Green MP, had been bankrupted by developers whom he had criticised. In fact, my brother, who's a QC, who occasionally acts for Wollongong Council, when I told him I was going down to Wollongong today, he advised me against making my usual jokey remarks about local developers and politicians because he told me I'd be sued for libel. So, yes, we do have. Australians like to think that they have a tradition of robust speech, but they don't, and thanks to the British common law. And you either introduce a Bill of Rights with a free speech, freedom of expression clause, or you persuade politicians to pass laws that change your libel law. But politicians who can generally point to the swimming pool that they've achieved from their damages from the Australian and the new kitchen they've put in, their damages from the Sydney Morning Herald, are rather reluctant to reform the libel laws. And so reform in Britain has come not from politicians, but from the introduction of a Bill of Rights with a freedom of speech clause.
John Mann, in his recent paper, talked about the unfairness of Part 3A of the Environmental Planning Act, and also about the regional planning bodies. And he made a very important point, that under this influence of law or application of the law, the basic rights of knowing the case against you, being able to present that case, and having an independent arbiter are all denied. Now, is there anything fundamental in our system whereby we can challenge the root of that law?
Well, that is exactly the kind of law that gets struck down by a Bill of Rights. If that happened in Britain, in New Zealand, in America, where you actually fixed the planning system so that you took away access to it, or you took away the independence of the arbiter, then you simply would not have an independent tribunal. And that would enable you, in Britain, of course, the Bill of Rights doesn't allow you to strike down parliamentary legislation, but most of these laws are not primary legislation. They're subsidiary legislation. They're passed by ministers without the full panoply of a parliamentary debate. And they turn out to be their regulations, their additions to law. And I have to say that in my Bill of Rights, the right to a pristine and healthy environment, I didn't read you further than promote conservation, protect native flora and fauna, but I did, going down to E, it is the right to have the environment protected through reasonable legislative and other measures that establish a planning system that ensures encroachments upon area of natural beauty or heritage value are not approved unless by a fair, transparent and non-corrupt process which takes that value into account. And I think that must be the basis of any right to a pristine environment, must be to have that fair, transparent and non-corrupt process which has been taken away from you by Section 3A.
Geoffrey, before you started speaking, a viewer phoned in with a viewer question. The Statute of Liberty speaks of the rights of minorities. How does that work out in England with respect to Sharia law and its apparent relentlessness to have its own way?
Sharia law is an interesting development in terms of a number of minority communities do have Sharia law practitioners, and a number of disputes we are seeing being solved by all parties submitting them to Sharia law practitioners. So far, so good. There are concerns, and they are real concerns, as to the areas where Sharia law conflicts with the Bill of Rights. And, of course, most drastically, it conflicts in a number of areas with the right to equal treatment between men and women, because in many areas it devalues a woman's testimony. And so at that point, Sharia law cannot be practiced in Britain because it conflicts with the Bill of Rights. But there are other areas where in minority communities it's proved very accessible and quite helpful as an alternative dispute mechanism. But it is nonetheless very important to ensure that those aspects of Sharia that impinge in particular upon the rights of women are curbed and are not permitted.
I think I'm aware that Geoffrey has become a function in Building 36 immediately following this, and I know he's been on his feet now for getting on for more than 90 minutes, and this was a small amount of time for him given that he does this quite frequently in courts. I think we have time for one more question, and we might call it. So you might need to move to the microphone. All right, go. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I wasn't.
How do we repeat that?
Well, we repeat, is Australia a racist nation? What are my thoughts on racism in Australia? Look, it is something that we have to come to terms with, like so many expatriates, but not expatriates. In London, we were very moved by Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generation. It's got to go further. I mentioned the first massacre of Aborigines at Wisden Cove in 1802, when the local magistrate, 140 were killed. He put their bones in a barrel and sent them for examination to Sydney. The massacres, particularly in Tasmania, I did this case a couple of years ago, where we stopped the Natural History Museum in Britain from experimenting with the skulls of the ancestors of the Tasmanian Aborigines that had been picked up by Lady Franklin and put on her mantelpiece, and, as a curio, and appalling stories and we have to obviously come to terms with that. But we have to hold true to our faith in a multinational society. The Cronulla riots in a multicultural society, the Cronulla events have not recurred. I think that's terribly important. Some of the causes of those events were not entirely a sort of narrow racism whipped up by Alan Jones, although that was part of the problem. Some of the problem was sexist attitudes of some of the Lebanese men. This is not something that can be, or should be, put under the counter. I've attempted to explore it in a hypothetical I did for Channel 9, and I think it's important to talk about talk it through, and to ensure that after all, we are not perceived as a racist nation. I have to say that the Howard government did its best to make us perceived as a racist nation through its various efforts to keep immigrants from the shore, through the barbed wire at Woomera was probably the worst kind of advertisement for Australia's failure, or that government's failure in racist terms. But it's a complicated question, but we have to, I believe, solve the problem of our own Indigenous people first. I'm persuaded that what must happen, if ultimately a treaty, but I'd like to see a few politicians, rather the countries that have been very effective in dealing with and making their Indigenous people part of their experience have been New Zealand and Mauritius, countries which offer Indigenous people 5, 6, 7 seats in their parliament. Quite frankly, I would be enormously proud if we had a couple of senators of the calibre of Noel Pearson and Mick Dodson and Marcia Langton. When I think of the kind of buffoons who, in my time, have held governments to ransom, the most stupid man I have ever met in my whole life is Brian Harradine, who was an absolute raving idiot like that could hold the balance of power in the Senate. And what have we now? Family first and so forth. It just seemed to me that if we had people like Mick Dodson and Marcia Langton, people like that, you could be actually proud of having those people in Parliament, maybe holding a balance of power in the Senate. But that is, at the end of the day, I think, the kind of compromise, the kind of not so much a compromise, but the kind of bargain, I'd rather put it on that basis, the kind of bargain we'll have to make with our own First Australians, and that will, like a Bill of Rights, be a source, I would hope, of pride to our grandchildren.